Josh Paunil does a great job over at PhillyMag.com, Birds 24/7, and a lot of speculation about the future of Sam Bradford and many others. Been a busy week, Josh, around this team when it's typically, a lot of Senior Bowl slow stuff, but we've really seen I guess the emerging figure who is Howie Roseman. I guess this week has really shown that Howie is really running things, at least at the personnel level again.
Yeah, and one thing that I was interested in that he said at the Senior Bowl in Alabama was that even, when that power was taken away from him last year, he was still kind of waiting in the wings and operating not as if he was going to return to the job after a year, but he was still operating as if he may have that control again someday. He was still watching the film, doing the same kind of studies and preparing for if he got the opportunity, and that's what I think you're seeing as he's kind of hit the ground running, obviously with the Ertz and Stella contracts and the return to the philosophy of, kind of locking up your core young guys while you can before they hit the open market.
Josh, Roseman was the GM from 2010 to 2014. Before that role went over to Chip Kelly. But even back in 2010, a lot of people think Andy Reid was really kind of pulling the strings from at least 2010 and 2011 in that draft. 2012, the Eagles had a pretty good draft. 13, they had a pretty good draft as well. When people think of Roseman, I think they think negatively, but should they?
I don't think they should think as negatively as they do. And a big reason is I think he has a good reputation around the league in terms of how he manages the contract and salary cap situation. I was talking to one agent yesterday, and he was just talking about Howie Roseman's ability to kind of decrease the cap hit of deals in the short term so it's more of a manageable contract. One thing I was talking specifically with this agent was about, a Sam Bradford deal. And, if they do a deal with Sam Bradford, we'll kind of handicap them because obviously he could command a lot of money. And what the agent said was, one thing that Howie Roseman does well, and Jake Rosenberg, who also works in the Eagles front office, is that they structure the contract so the cap hit is more spread out. So even if they have a deal that seems like a lot of money, especially the guaranteed money up front, they can split that cap hit. So you're not really handicapped by a deal.
Yeah, now, we were talking about this earlier. It's a good point that you brought up because we were kind of discussing, Kelly kind of left them in some cap issues, some cap problems here. I guess if Kelly was the guy leaving, Roseman is a pretty good guy to be following because that's something that he really excels at. And, if you're trying to clean up the contracts, do you look at the Ertz deal and the Selleck deal as team-friendly type deals, a deal that Howie Roseman did a good job at?
Definitely, particularly with the Ertz deal. One kind of label that was thrown out there a lot was, well, it's a lot of money because it's a top 5 tight end type deal. But one thing to keep in mind is that market, I think, is really going to change in the coming months when you have other top tight ends like Tyler Eifert, Jordan Reed, and all other those guys who have had more production than Zach Ertz. Their deals are going to get redone, and they're going to get new and better deals. So once those deals happen, the Ertz number would have gone way up. So I think the timing of the Zach Ertz deal is especially good because, like I said, the market is going to go up for tight ends in the coming months. So I think it was good to get this deal out of the way now before you have kind of the rest of the league bumping up that number.
Which is very Howie Roseman-esque from the past, where he would lock up guys undervalued, and then 2 or 3 years down the road, they want to hold out because they don't like their deals. We saw that happen a lot during that Roseman, Banner, Reed era.
Yeah, especially, and that's kind of the thing that I've heard is that, they're going back with Howie Roseman and Jake Rosenberg, who I mentioned before. They're going back to the old Joe Banner approach of finding the key young guys, lock them up early, then kind of build around that, which obviously under Chip in the limited time that he was there, it wasn't exactly the same philosophy that Chip was going by, kind of treating guys more as commodities and players and building off them. So I do think it's a positive direction that they're going in, specifically in terms of the contracts and salary cap situation with Howie Roseman at the helm.
All right, Josh Paunil, Birds 24/7 over at PhillyMag.com. He writes, why Sam Bradford may reject a multi-year deal. A lot of people, this one is a very interesting scenario. Chip Kelly kind of tangled a web to this new regime here. Do they franchise him? Do they offer him the big money? There's been some reports that, they asked for $25 million prior to the season, and maybe even ask St. Louis that. That could be the reason why he's here. But if the Eagles present him a multi-year deal, is it a slam dunk that he takes it?
No, and that's the one thing I thought was interesting with the people I was talking to yesterday was one thing to keep in mind with Sam Bradford is obviously, with these reports of the money that he's been asking for, he has a pretty high valuation of himself in terms of his, future worth. So one thing that wouldn't surprise the people in the league is if Sam Bradford, just takes a one-year deal and kind of bets on himself because, this year, although he showed the signs of progression, he obviously had a much better second half of the year than the first half of the year. Teams are going to be able to kind of use that first half of the year against him because overall, as a whole season, his numbers in production wasn't very good. It wasn't overly impressive. So one thing you could see is Sam Bradford saying, okay, well, my value right now, at least according to the market value in other teams, isn't that high. So what his agent, Tom Condon, could do is, all right, we'll just take a one-year deal with the team, and we'll bet on you having a better year so you can get a good long-term deal. Because if he's locked up into a multi-year deal this offseason and he plays better in that first year, he's going to be stuck making that same money years 2, 3, and maybe 4. So with all the money that Sam Bradford has made, because he was that last number 1 pick under the old system where a first-round pick could make, or a first overall pick could make $70 million, just crazy figures. He's already made enough money where he can bet on himself and not really be, out of huge losses if he doesn't materialize and have that production he expects next season.
Good stuff from Josh. Read that over at Birds 24/7 at PhillyMag.com. What's your take on Fletcher Cox moving forward? I know there's been a lot of reports they want to lock him up. Is it smart? It's smart for the Eagles, I think, anyway, to lock him up, knowing that Ndamukong Suh, Marcel Darius are some of the guys who have hit free agency and made some big money. Specifically, Suh playing for Jim Schwartz. Cox might get into the system and put up some big-time numbers. So if you're the Eagles, you probably want to lock him up. But what kind of money is Fletcher Cox going to get?
Yeah, and that's one thing that I was especially talking to people yesterday was, just as a general rule of thumb, it's always better to lock up the good young players early on before they hit the market value because the value of Fletcher Cox is only going to rise and appreciate. So just as a general rule of thumb, you should always do that. But particularly with Fletcher Cox, he's probably waiting on that Muhammad Wilkerson new deal because that's going to set the market. I mentioned before how smart the Eagles to lock up Ertz before, the Jordan Reed and other tight ends new deals. It would be good if the Eagles got Fletcher Cox to re-sign before Muhammad Wilkerson's new deal. But simply with Fletcher Cox, I think you're talking around the $16 million per year range. But that number could certainly go up. Yeah, so that number though could certainly go up, not just after a Muhammad Wilkerson deal, but particularly if he has a big year in this new Jim Schwartz 4-3 defense, which I think he will. He's going to be able to be more aggressive, get more tackles and sacks, and I think he's really going to thrive in this defense. And it really could hurt the Eagles' wallet if they keep waiting and wait for Fletcher Cox to put up big numbers and have other defensive linemen get big deals. Yeah,
that's one of the things I think you got to consider. Give me your take, Josh. Yesterday, Peterson sounded like a guy who wanted to bring Jason Peters back. Now, we know Peters is 34. He's got 3 years left on a pretty big deal, about $30 million left on that deal. 9.5 cap hit. A lot of people just thought, all right, it's time to move on to Lane Johnson. But Peterson sounded like he was a guy who wanted to bring Jason Peters back. What's your take on bringing Peters back?
Yeah, I was a little surprised by that. And, Jason made clear after the season ended that, he wasn't going to move to guard or anything like that. And you have that cap hit, and you're thinking, okay, maybe they'll get rid of him or restructure his deal if that's an option. But Peterson just, flatly said, as you mentioned, I'd like to have him back. And I'm a little surprised by that, to be honest, because with not just the production, really, the slightly declined production this past season wasn't my biggest concern. It's just that when he had the injuries, even though he wasn't missing entire games back to back to back, he only played about, 60 or 65% of the snaps over the course of the whole season because oftentimes he would be get in the game and then he'd leave after the first or second quarter. So kind of as he's getting older and you have these increased injury risks, that's what my concern is, and not necessarily how productive he'll be when he's on the field and healthy.
All right, Josh, they're down there at the Senior Bowl this week, and obviously they pick at 13. We're a little ways off from really getting our hands dirty with the draft, but some people think it's either, Bradford or a drafted quarterback at 13. What scenarios do you see at the quarterback position?
Well, one thing that's just fascinating is, especially at the Senior Bowl, Carson Wentz has just gotten a ton of buzz because he's the best prospect in Mobile, and obviously the quarterback's always going to get the media attention. But in terms of when you look at mock drafts and hear people's opinions around the league, it's really varied. Some people might have him as, a top 5 guy, whereas others may not even have him in the top 20. So I think that's one thing that's going to be really interesting and tough if you're the Eagles and you're at 13. It's really hard to bet on, okay, who's going to be there, because there's no clear-cut, Marcus Mariota, Jameis Winston type situation where these guys are going to go in these 2 slots. And that's one thing that I think will actually help Bradford a little bit when he's, trying to get a new deal with whoever he gets to deal with. Is, Tom Condon, his agent's going to be like, well, maybe you're interested in a Carson Wentz or a Paxton Lynch, but it doesn't matter because you have no idea if they're going to be available when you draft. So I think that's one thing that's going to be very interesting to follow, because we don't know, and we really don't have a good idea of where he'll go in the draft.
And we should possibly get an indication of the Eagles' thinking, you would think, because free agency comes before the draft, about where Bradford's future will be. But I guess a scenario could arise where they franchise him and then he kind of leaves them flapping in the wind.
Yeah, and that's one thing where, if Bradford stays, I think that unless someone at the top of the draft just falls to them, like a Miles Jack or maybe Jalen Ramsey, but offensive line's obviously a huge area of need. You have Taylor Decker of Ohio State, offensive tackle, Jack Conklin of Michigan State, another offensive tackle. So if Bradford stays, obviously to me, obviously the big need is offensive line. But if Bradford, is gone, then it's going to be interesting to see if they want to trade up maybe, or maybe they'll get to their slot and somehow Carson Wentz falls and maybe another quarterback falls and they trade back. So that draft day, if they're looking for a quarterback, could be very interesting in that first round.
Sure could. And the last order of business with you, Josh, I guess would be Vinny Curry. A lot of people, I think the Giants are going to be an interesting team in this. They really need a pass rush. How much money is Curry going to get, and does he want to come back to Philadelphia? Does this defense entice him enough to come back? Because he sorely was misused the last couple of years, or underused, because he was really in the wrong system.
Yeah, Vinny Curry, even when he wasn't clearly saying it, he was pretty clear indicating that he'd rather be in a 4-3 defense than a 3-4, so that's certainly going to help them. If they still have Billy Davis and we're running the same 3-4 scheme, I think the Eagles have no shot at re-signing Vinny Curry. But with this new Jim Schwartz 4-3, I think he's going to reciprocate interest, and they're definitely going to try and bring him back. In terms of how much he'll get, one thing that I've heard is that teams kind of like to keep internal salary consistency. What that means is when you have a guy like Brandon Graham making $6.5 million, the Eagles are going to be sensitive to how much Brandon Graham makes when they're making that offer to Vinny Curry. So to be honest, I would be surprised if Vinny Curry got much more than that $6.5 million per year that Brandon Graham currently makes.
You can read more from Josh over at PhillyMag.com. Birds 24/7, all Eagles, all the time. Him and Tim and the guys do a great job. Tim's down there in Alabama. You lucked out on that one, I guess, huh?
Yeah. I'm looking forward, though, to going to Indianapolis. You get to spend a little more time there.
Cool.
A little more time around the prospects and coaches and the people around the league. So I'm looking forward to the Combine.
Nice. Of course, we'll talk to Josh when he's at the Combine. Josh, always a pleasure, pal. Enjoy.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Always good. Josh is great with the All-22. He's got a great All-22 look of what Jim Schwartz's defense could look like, and he really projects how the Eagles will fit in that system. We talked about that last week.